Okay.
And I want to start right away with the first question.
Please.
Professor Robinson, thank you very much for your time. You discuss in the article titled Populism and Political Development in Hybrid Regimes, Russia and the Development of Official Populism, how populist rhetoric in Russia evolved alongside other political frames, such as the emphasis on constitutional order and legality. Could you elaborate on how these competing discourses were strategically employed to stabilize regimes' hybridity and how they may have interacted with each other to shape political discourse in Russia?
Thank you. It's a very good question. Obviously, sort of Russia is a very different type of populism to the forms of populism that we're most familiar with in Europe or Latin America, although there are significant differences between those as well. But in Russia, the form of populism that developed in order to provide stability for the regime when it faced electoral threats in 2011-2012. And it developed in order to create a means of excluding political rivals to Vladimir Putin, whilst at the same time allowing the regime to claim that there was a democratic core to the system. So whilst you got this much more authoritarian form of politics coming, whilst you got this much more ideological form of politics developing in Russia after 2011-2012, it did so by promising that there was some democratic continuity within the Russian political system, that this was not, as it might otherwise have been described, simply a power grab by Vladimir Putin. It was, in fact, sort of a more authentic form of democracy, which was emerging within the constitutional system that already existed. So the regime, sort of maintained and continued, sort of other discursive frames about democracy, about market economy, and married them to this sort of new political discourse around conservative cultural traditional values that created the sort of the ideological difference to the sort of the first stages of Putin's presidency. So all of these things came together to sort of create this idea of stability, to create this idea of continuity. This is not, sort of in any way a radical form of populism. It's not a populism that seeks to sort of completely restructure the political system in order to unveil the will of the people. It is, sort of promising continuity to protect the popular will and to ensure that that popular will is not displaced by alien values. So, sort of the other forms of political discourse that Putin has used are very important and shouldn't be ignored in political analysis. They sometimes, unfortunately, are, as people just concentrate on the traditional conservative sort of themes of his speeches and see those as being the only elements of ideology that matter. All of the pieces matter to construct Putinism, and the use of them has changed over time, which means that, sort of the regime has been able to respond differently to different problems that it's had, and, sort of it's continued to do that ever since 2012 and ever since it began to use these populist tropes.
You discussed the development of official populism under Vladimir Putin, particularly its acceleration after 2012. Could you elaborate on factors that contributed to this rapid acceleration, and how did the war in Ukraine reinforce the narrative of official populism?
Well, in some ways, although one doesn't want to draw too neat a line, there is a line between the articulation of the official sort of populist position that Sarah and I described in that article that you referred to, and the war in Ukraine. So the reasons for the articulation of official populism were to protect the political system and to protect and to give some sort of purpose to the political system in order to justify Putin's coming back to power. So there was a sort of a very pragmatic element to this. I mean, it was instrumental as a discourse. But, sort of the discourse then begins to sort of take on a life of its own, if you like. It took a life of its own as it sort of permeated the media structure of Russia, the official media structure, and created, sort of the more aggressive, nationalistic, anti-liberal media environment that exists in Russia today, and that has, sort of been in place for, sort of the last decade or so. So, on the one hand, sort of the ideology of conservative traditionalism that was the core of Putin's populism went into the sort of popular consciousness through the media infrastructure. It also, however, sort of began to permeate other areas of policymaking, but it didn't do that until much later. It began to sort of become much more a feature of foreign policy discourse slowly over the course of the 2010s, and it began to sort of structure how Russian democracy was described and what the purpose of Russian democracy was. And it did that in particular in 2020 when Putin changed the constitution, and sort of ideological themes which are expressly banned in other articles of the Russian constitution, came into the constitution and sort of framed the notion in the constitution of what the character of the Russian people are. So gradually, sort of the populist sort of message spread, and it became, something which was more and more, if you like, independent of Putin as its original articulating agent. It became a more of a structural force in and of itself. And Ukraine was a problem within this discourse because Ukraine is supposed to be a part of this Russian world that shares the same values as the Russian people and the different traditional religions that exist within Russia, and that sort of created sort of an ontological trap in sort of Putin's ideology. How can you exist in a way that you claim is sort of authentic to the Russian world, when in another part of the Russian world somebody else is living in a different way? Somewhere else is changing their relationships to the West. Someone else is embracing the liberalism that you say is a threat, embracing, sort of the European direction of development that you say is, sort of a betrayal of people's organic interests. So, sort of, although there was, sort of no neat line from the articulation of the official populist position in 2012 onwards, and in particular in the period 2012 to sort of 2014, the war, reflects the biases and the concerns of Putin's official populism, and sort of is in some ways a response to the most pressing and greatest threat to that discourse, which was somebody in the Russian world living in a different way. So, sort of once the war began, obviously, sort of that just embeds that discourse deeper and further, and also creates something that didn't exist before, which is a need to mobilize around that discourse. The discourse was, sort of exclusionary in the first instance. It was about denying the political agency of liberals, denying the political agency of ethno-nationalists in Russia, of sort of creating a language that sort of Putin and the Kremlin could use to sort of control political participation and to make any other form of political participation out to be illegitimate and futile. With sort of the change that came with the war, it became a basis for mobilization in its own right. So sort of we've seen sort of use of symbols, a greater emphasis on patriotic education, sort of the drawing of the educational sphere, both for school-age children and higher education, into the sort of to use a very old phrase, sort of to become part of the sort of the ideological state apparatus. All of these things have, sort of deepened and expanded with the war. So, sort of the war's relationship to populism is complex, but has also changed the way in which sort of populism is activated and performed in Russia.
All right. You argue that official populism in Russia is primarily centered around cultural themes, lacking a significant focus on socioeconomic or political issues. How does this cultural-centric approach impact the regime's ability to address the material needs of different social groups within Russia? Are there potential conflicts between the cultural narrative of official populism and the economic realities faced by the populace?
Yes, I mean, it was about politics, and it was about sort of values rather than about economic and social development for Russia, and that I think was very deliberate. I mean, what you had was a populism that the regime could perform and could declare success in, independently of economic circumstance, because sort of having come out of the economic crisis that sort of affected, sort of large parts of the world after 2007, 2008. Russia had failed to deal with what it had itself described as the structural causes of crisis. And it was unclear how they were going to do that. So they needed some sort of political line around which they could construct a narrative of success. And the populist line was that. But it didn't sort of suppose any structural economic changes. It didn't push any particular policies economically. It was all about, sort of political legitimacy, very narrowly described. So, sort of economics was left to, sort of other, kind of discourses. And they were important, but they were a continuation of the sort of ineffective forms of marrying patronage politics with marketization that had, sort of failed really to generate economic growth in Russia independent of its energy industries and wealth. So, sort of the system was, kind of responding to the problems that Russia faced on a very narrow basis. And sort of that has been one of the problems of Putin. How do you sort of back up sort of the populist success that you can declare, and that you can sort of perform in your speeches and in your aggressive acts towards the West and the sort of Western hegemony that you describe, with something that's tangible and real. And the regime's never really found a way around that, except accidentally. Accidentally, sort of it rediscovered economic growth after sort of about 2012 because of a pickup of energy prices. Accidentally, it's rediscovered a form of economic growth after its declaration of war in Ukraine through a form of military Keynesianism, basically pumping money into the military economy and seeing some spillover effects from that into the rest of the economy. But these things are not, sort of laying the basis for the long-term development of Russia. And, sooner or later, the war will end. Hopefully sooner, but sooner or later the war will end, and you will have to work out how you're going to, sort of deal with the development problems that Russia has, how you're going to have to sort of deal with, sort of depletion horizons in the oil industry, all of those factors that existed before. So the focus on cultural values has come at a cost to Russia. That cost has not been damaging totally to the regime in the short term because they've been lucky. But sort of you can't be lucky forever.
In your article titled Putin and the Incompleteness of Putinism, you argue against both the notion that Putinism resembles Soviet ideology and the idea that ideology plays a negligible role in Putin's regime. Could you elaborate on why neither of these extremes accurately characterizes Putinism and what implications this has for understanding contemporary Russian politics?
Yes, that's an absolutely massive question. There is a tendency, I think, in Russian studies to always be looking for a Soviet analogy. So, sort of a lot of the things that are written about Putin and ideology are seen through sort of the Soviet lens. And there were two sides to that lens of looking at ideology in the Soviet Union. One was to say that the system was completely idiocratic. That, sorry, that, if you like, was the old sort of totalitarian view of the Soviet Union. So there is an immense temptation to say that as Russia becomes more authoritarian, it's relapsing into Soviet-style practices. And the other sort of side of the coin was to say, well, we don't know whether Soviet leaders believe in all this, sort of Marxist-Leninist stuff. They don't appear always to be, particularly philosophically sophisticated, at least, sort of after Lenin. So, sort of, is this all just lip service? And really, sort of, there's no way we can trace anything back ideologically to Marx or even to Lenin particularly. So, sort of we should just look at what the material interests are that are involved in politics and focus on those things instead. Now, the problem with, sort of those two explanations are that, first of all, it sets a very high bar for calling something ideological. If something has to be based on a supposed sort of structured ideological worldview, such as Marxism, Leninism claim to be, then, there are very few ideologies in the world. And, sort of, that sort of means that kind of we're really sort of forcing Putinism into certain positions that are sort of not very sort of intellectually sustainable. Kind of from an analytical point of view, and vice versa. We're then, if we're saying that Putinism isn't ideological, ignoring all of those things and sort of trying to work out what's going on within the Kremlin and supposing that sort of the discourse that is articulated has no effect. But it does have an effect. Sort of it is used. It is, something that's affecting, as you said, the media environment that people are consuming. It is affecting, sort of who is allowed to engage in politics. It is more than just pragmatism. And it's not something that you can easily back away from. sort of you can't just simply say none of this stuff matters. We were kidding. Sort of everything we've said for the last 12 years is an irrelevance. So the sort of Putin is, kind of the new Stalin line of argument is an exaggeration, as is the, sort of argument that Putin is merely a pragmatic politician. We have to sort of find some way between those two poles. And the way to try and find, sort of a way through it is to sort of think of this as, sort of not an ideology in the sense of, one of the grand narratives of human progress from the past, like, sort of Marxism, but to think of this as a discourse. And this discourse contains cultural conservative elements, but it also contains other things as well. It contains, sort of a discourse about constitutionality and democracy. It contains a discourse about economic development and growth. Sort of these things are frequently in tension with one another and are not well served by one another, but, sort of they all exist. And looking at how they exist and interact with one another gives us what Putinism is. And it's not the Soviet Union. Neither is it, some sort of completely pragmatic authoritarian dictatorship, which is, sort of serving the interests of a small elite. The elite is serviced, but there is more to the system than that. So, there are dangers of going, sort of too far one way or the other. The danger at the moment is that we go too far in the totalitarian direction because of the war. And because of the changes that we've seen with the war, which have, created this more mobilizing environment, which does look a lot more, sort of totalitarian, because, sort of it is, sort of reaching out to the people in a way that the sort of earlier populism didn't. But still, sort of, it's a bit much to kind of sort of sweep things totally into the sort of totalitarian sort of category and not think about those other things and what they mean. So what I was trying to do in that article was, sort of give a bit of a warning about, sort of going too far in one direction or another, and sort of we should keep our minds open and not ignore what is said simply because sort of we think it's rubbish, which intellectually a lot of it is. Sort of we should sort of look at what its effect is, sort of even if we don't rate it as a sort of coherent set of ideas that sort of are based on some deep philosophical position.
Right. You argue that Putinism has ideological layers rather than a cohesive ideology. Could you elaborate on how these layers interact and how they contribute to the overall political discourse in contemporary Russia?
It's a really difficult question for me to answer, not because I don't believe in it, but because I think sort of changes are happening between the relationships between these layers, and that's something I'm sort of still trying to get my head around. So what I argued originally was that sort of what you saw after 2012 was what I called a regime discourse. Sorry, and this regime discourse was these conservative ideas, and these were kind of promoted to create this sort of reason for Putin to come back to the presidency in 2012 and to create a means of legitimating the system. But sort of those ideas were quite narrow. They focused on a few particular topics. Those topics were then sort of taken up and expanded by, let's call them ideological entrepreneurs for a better term. And these were, sort of people in the media, people in some political parties supporting Putin and the regime, who sort of took them and sort of developed them and creating what I called a regime supporting discourse. So they took certain ideas from, sort of Putin, and they expanded them and connected them to other, concepts that had been floating around in the Russian political system to expand on the regime discourse in order to sort of create positions for themselves, to, give them a piece in the sort of the media infrastructure of Russia, and to, further the reach of the regime's own discourse. So there were these layers. There were things that, sort of Putin talked about, and then there were those things that Putin talked about, plus other things, if you like, that sort of second-rank political figures, people who weren't necessarily formally within the political system, who were part of the media, who were part of, Putin supporting parties, whether they be in the sort of the official opposition or not, and they sort of created another layer of discourse. And the separation between those layers was fairly clear up until about 2020. And when you got the constitutional changes, what you in some ways saw was Putin allowing those ideas from the regime supporting discourse, which was broader, to come into and become part of the regime's discourse. So you had this interaction and you had this change, and you had and the clearest kind of sort of watershed moment where it happens is around the constitutional changes in 2020. You had this sort of expansion, if you like, of the regime's discourse from below. And they became much more of an integral and integrated discourse. So when I was writing that paper that you referred to, I think it was published in 2019, maybe early 2020, I forget, but it was certainly written sort of 2018, 2019. So, what things look like in terms of the separation of ideas shifted. And that, I think is quite an important change. And, is another reason why, you can't simply say all of this is pragmatic, because the more that changes, and the more you get that sort of flowing in from below of ideas into the sort of the official discourse, and used by Putin and used by other people, the harder it is to back out of all of this. Now, the key, one of the ways you can sort of tell this, for example, is by looking at some of the things that were used. So, one of the things that was used in regime supporting discourse was arguments about Russophobia, that the West is, pathologically anti-Russian. Those were not ideas which were used by people at the apex of the political system like Putin very much. They said that there was a Russophobia in the world, but they were very targeted in who was Russophobic and how Russophobia manifested itself. And it wasn't a common property of all politicians who disagreed with Russia. That was something that happened in the regime supporting discourse. Look at the way the world hates us. But of course, now that's flipped, right? They all use it. Putin uses it, regularly. The paint of Russophobia is slapped onto everybody and everything, continually. So you can see the way in which certain ideas travel between these layers over time, and the relayering, if you like, has been something that has been reinforced by the war. To come back to that earlier question, and as I say, means that these things are developing and enforcing authoritarianism and creating grounds for repression in new ways.
Right. In the light of Vladimir Putin's landslide victory in recent election, just weeks after the murder of Alexei Navalny, what strategies do you anticipate him employing to further consolidate his power domestically? particularly considering the heightened repression of dissent and independent voices witnessed in the lead up to the election?
More of the same. Sort of more repression, more control, more doubling down on labeling domestic opponents as foreign agents, as traitors, as people who sort of don't display the correct patriotic spirit. More mobilization around these things, more effort to lodge them into people's minds through the education system and the media system. In other words, sort of one of the things that people have frequently talked about is what's sometimes called a collective Putin, right? That, Putin isn't there at the top on his own. There is a sort of circle of support. And yes, that was always true. Obviously, no man, not even Vladimir Putin, is an island. But sort of the attempt to sort of transform that collective Putin into the not simply the hegemonic identity that Russians are supposed to buy into, but sort of into a true collective and uncontestable identity. So sort of the expansion of these things, sort of in that sense, maybe ultimately, kind of we will be talking about, sort of Putinism as something other than official populism. Sort of it might be, sort of better labeled something else. But that's work in progress, and sort of how far that's pushed, how quickly that's pushed is something that we're going to have to wait and see.
All right. Given the international condemnation of the election as a sham and the concerns raised about its legitimacy, how do you envision Putin leveraging his victory to advance Russia's interests on the global stage, particularly concerning the ongoing occupation of Ukraine?
Well, I mean, it's obviously going to be used to justify the annexation of those territories that they say are now part of the Russian Federation, which, sort of, if you look at the figures, all supposedly voted overwhelmingly for Putin in the election. So, Sevastopol, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, etc. All of those areas came out in support for Putin. Insofar as anybody came out in support for Putin, and the figures are not fraudulent, which of course they are. But that sort of is going to be something that sort of they will try and use, just in the same way that they tried to use the referendum in Crimea in 2014 about its annexation into Russia to legitimate the changes. Those things won't wash with large parts of the sort of mainstream political opinion in the West, but they do, sort of wash in other places and with some other politicians. We've seen it even amongst some politicians in Europe that sort of they congratulated Putin and said that the people have spoken. So, sort of the people who are sympathetic to the Putin's populist international, authoritarian international, whatever you want to call it, sort of are going to be supporting the Kremlin's narrative about what these elections were and how they show support that exists for Putin. So, sort of, I'm not really expecting anything particularly new. Sort of just more of the same, doubling down, if you like, on the narratives that have been out there for quite some time now, and sort of further exclusion of dissident voices inside Russia, which sort of we quite clearly saw. During the election, sort of the death of Navalny, further imprisonments, arrests, sort of persecution for our participation in protests over the elections. All of those things are just going to continue, you know, that's just the sort of ongoing tragedy of Russia today.
And lastly, Professor Robinson, considering the recent terror attack in Moscow claimed by the Islamic State group, how do you anticipate President Putin will leverage this event to strengthen his regime's position domestically and internationally?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen it, haven't we? You know, sort of this feeble attempt to link it to Ukraine, this continuing, ongoing narrative that terrorist attacks that happen in Russia are, you know, sort of part of some broader global conspiracy, that they are encouraged by the West and by the United States in particular. That we've seen that, you know, sort of countless times over other sort of terror events, that, you know, sort of that these have been things that have been promoted and prompted by the West and have not been constrained by the West, even though, you know, sort of Western agencies like intelligence services in the United States warned against some of these attacks. So, you know, sort of it all feeds into this sort of conspiratorial narrative that has become such an important part of Putinism, that, you know, sort of it is us against the world, and you are effectively either for us or against us, and that, you know, sort of you know, sort of is clearly the narrative that the Russians want to shape, even as they've begun to sort of say, okay, yes, you know, sort of some of this is the fault of Islamic terrorists, of, you know, ISK, but, you know, sort of ISK itself is a product of the West. It's a product of, you know, sort of Western destabilization of the world. It's a product of, you know, sort of Western arrogance, and we're the ones who are suffering for that unfairly in their view.
Professor Robinson, thank you so very much.
Pleasure.
Appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you very much.